March 26, 1945. Okinawa Prefecture. The dawn broke slowly over the jagged limestone ridges of southern Okinawa, painting the sky in shades of ash and copper. The air carried the acrid smell of cordite mixed with salt water, a scent that had become the island's signature in these brutal spring days. In the mouth of a cave system near the village of Itoman, an elderly woman named Fumiko Nakamura pressed her body against the damp rock wall, her grandson's small hand trembling in hers. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery had been replaced by something more terrifying in its unfamiliarity: silence. The Americans had arrived. For weeks, the Japanese Imperial Command had told them what to expect: demons in human form, beasts who would defile their women, torture their children, and mock their ancestors before executing them all. The loudspeakers had been explicit: death was preferable to capture. The grenade each family had been issued was an act of imperial mercy. Fumiko's fingers had traced its cold metal surface 100 times in the darkness, preparing herself for the moment she would have to pull the pin. But now, as footsteps echoed outside the cave, as foreign voices called out in that strange, harsh language, her hand remained frozen. She could not do it. She simply could not. The story of what happened next, in that cave and in thousands like it across Okinawa, would become one of the most profound and least discussed transformations of the Pacific War. It was not a story of battles won or territory claimed, but of a collision between propaganda and reality so stark that it would shatter the ideological foundations that had sustained Japanese civilian resistance. The imperial government had spent years constructing an image of the American enemy, an image so monstrous that civilians would choose death over capture. What they had not prepared for, what they could never have anticipated, was the possibility that their enemy might arrive with medical supplies instead of bayonets, with gentle hands instead of raised fists, with a fundamental respect for human dignity that contradicted everything their people had been taught to believe. The Battle of Okinawa, which began on April 1, 1945, was not merely the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific theater. It was a threshold, a bloody crossing into the Japanese homeland itself. For the first time, American forces would fight not just against the imperial military, but alongside, around, and ultimately for a massive civilian population that had been integrated into the defensive strategy as human shields, as laborers, as combatants, and as propaganda tools. The Japanese command structure had learned from previous island battles. They understood that American forces showed restraint around civilians, that this restraint could be weaponized, that the presence of women, children, and elderly could slow the American advance and complicate their tactic. What they did not understand, what their own cultural framework prevented them from comprehending, was that this American restraint was not a weakness to be exploited, but the manifestation of a value system so fundamentally different from their own that contact with it would prove more devastating to Japanese morale than any artillery barrage. By late March 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into the southern strongholds, they encountered a humanitarian crisis that military planners had anticipated but never fully prepared for. Tens of thousands of Okinawan civilians, caught between the grinding advance of American forces and the fanatical resistance of Japanese defenders, had fled into the island's extensive cave systems. These were not soldiers. They were farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, grandmothers holding infants, children separated from parents in the chaos. They were starving, wounded, diseased, and utterly terrified. Japanese soldiers had moved among them in the days before, distributing grenades, repeating the warnings: "Your enemy is not human, they will torture you, death is honor, surrender is eternal shame." Many believed it. The propaganda had been relentless, consistent, and appeared to be confirmed by the violence of the American bombardment. How could a nation that rained such fire from the sky show mercy on the ground? The 96th Infantry Division, pushing through the Kakazu Ridge area in early April, was among the first to confront this reality in scale. Combat engineers, advancing carefully through contested terrain, began discovering caves that had been fortified as fighting positions but were packed with civilians. The standard protocol was clear: call for surrender in Japanese, offer safe passage, allow time for response. What was not standard was what happened when the civilians emerged. Lieutenant James Morrison, a combat medic from rural Pennsylvania, recorded his first encounter in a letter that would later be preserved in the division's archives. "We found them in the third cave system, maybe 50 people, mostly women and old folks. They came out expecting to be shot. You could see it in their faces. This old man must have been 80. He just stood there with his hands up, shaking so hard his whole body was convulsing. Our interpreter called out that they were safe, that we had doctors, that we had food. The old man collapsed. Just collapsed. When our medic reached him, started checking his pulse, talking soft, the old man started crying. Not quiet crying, loud, like something breaking open inside him." This scene, repeated across hundreds of encounters in the first weeks of the battle, revealed something the Japanese command had not considered. The Okinawan civilians were not ideologically committed to Imperial ideology in the way Japanese mainlanders were. They were a subjugated population, colonized and culturally suppressed, conscripted into a war they had not chosen. The propaganda had frightened them, yes, but it had not convinced them. They were desperate, not devoted. And when American medics began treating their wounded, when doctors examined their sick children with the same care they would show American soldiers, when corpsmen shared their own rations with elderly who had not eaten in days, the contrast between what they had been told and what they experienced became impossible to ignore. The American Military Medical Corps in the Pacific had evolved considerably by 1945. Early in the war, treatment of civilian populations in combat zones had been improvised, inconsistent, and often neglected in favor of military priorities. But by the time of the Okinawa campaign, the system had been refined. Medical battalions were equipped not just for combat casualties but for civilian care. They carried extra supplies, interpreters had been trained in medical terminology, and perhaps most importantly, the cultural education of American servicemen had improved. Officers had been briefed on Okinawan customs, on the difference between Okinawan civilians and Japanese military, on the strategic importance of humane treatment. This was not purely humanitarian, it was tactical. Every civilian treated well was one less body shielding a Japanese machine gun nest, one less person who might be coerced into a suicide attack, one less propaganda victory for the Imperial command. But something beyond tactics was at work. In the letters, the journals, the recorded testimonies of American servicemen who participated in these encounters, a consistent theme emerges. They were shocked by the condition of the civilians. They were moved by the elderly, in particular, by the way Japanese propaganda had convinced these vulnerable people that they would be brutalized. And they were determined, almost personally determined, to prove that propaganda wrong. Corporal Thomas Chin, a Chinese-American medic from San Francisco, described treating an elderly woman with infected shrapnel wounds. "She kept flinching every time I moved, like she expected me to hit her. I kept talking, even though she couldn't understand the words, just keeping my voice calm. When I started cleaning the wound, she grabbed my hand. I thought she was trying to push me away, but she wasn't. She was holding on. Her whole body was shaking, but she was holding my hand, and she was looking at my face like she was trying to understand something. After I bandaged her up, gave her sulfa drugs for the infection, she bowed. Deep, formal bow. Our interpreter said she was thanking me for letting her die with dignity. I told the interpreter, tell her she's not going to die, tell her we're going to make sure she doesn't die. When he translated that, she just stared at me. Like I'd said something impossible. This moment, this collision of expectations, became the crucible in which Japanese propaganda began to disintegrate. The imperial narrative depended on the Americans behaving as monsters. It required atrocities, or at minimum, callous indifference. What it encountered instead was a medical corps that treated enemy civilians with a level of care that shocked even the American soldiers providing it. Mobile hospitals were established behind the front lines specifically for civilian casualties. Doctors performed surgeries on elderly Okinawans with the same priority they gave to wounded GIs. Nurses, many of them women, provided care that contradicted every warning about American soldiers' intentions toward Japanese women. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything the civilians had been told was contradicted by direct experience. And unlike propaganda, experience could not be dismissed or rationalized away. The symbolic power of medical care in this context cannot be overstated. In Japanese military culture, weakness was shameful. The elderly, the wounded, the sick, they were burdens in a total war context. There are documented cases of Japanese soldiers killing wounded civilians to prevent them from slowing retreats, of elderly being abandoned in caves because they could not keep pace. This was not universal, not all Japanese soldiers were cruel, but the ideology that informed these decisions, that survival of the strong served the empire, that individual suffering was irrelevant to collective glory, this ideology was pervasive. When American medics arrived carrying stretchers for elderly who could not walk, when they used precious medical supplies on people who had no military value, when they showed patience and gentleness to those whom Japanese propaganda had dismissed as expendable, they demonstrated something that was philosophically threatening to the entire imperial worldview. They demonstrated that individual human dignity, even the dignity of enemy civilians, even the dignity of the elderly and weak, held value in American eyes. Fumiko Nakamura, the grandmother in the Itoman cave, was among those who experienced this dissonance firsthand. When American soldiers finally entered her cave, when they found her and 17 others huddled in the darkness, they did not open fire. They called out in Japanese. They offered food. They carried lights but did not blind them. When Fumiko's grandson, malnourished and barely conscious, was lifted by an American corpsman, she later recalled thinking she would never see him alive again. But the corpsman carried the boy out into the sunlight, laid him on a stretcher, and within minutes a doctor was examining him, inserting in 4-line, speaking in low tones to a nurse who administered fluids, and what Fumiko later learned was glucose. The boy survived. More than survived, within 3 days he was sitting up, eating, responding. The transformation was so rapid that Fumiko believed, at first, that it was some kind of American magic. It was not magic. It was antibiotics, hydration therapy, and nutritional supplementation. It was the application of modern medicine to a child who had been slowly dying of preventable causes. But to Fumiko, watching from the civilian internment camp where she and others had been taken, it was proof that everything she had been told was a lie. The civilian internment camps established by American forces on Okinawa were intended as temporary holding facilities, places to process refugees, screen for Japanese soldiers disguising themselves as civilians, and provide basic care before relocation. In practice, they became theaters of ideological transformation. Civilians who arrived expecting imprisonment, forced labor, or execution found instead medical tents, food distribution centers, and remarkably, a degree of autonomy. They were not free to leave, security concerns were paramount, but within the camps they could organize themselves, practice their customs, care for their families. American personnel assigned to camp management had been instructed to minimize cultural disruption, to allow Japanese language and customs, to respect religious practices. This was partly pragmatic. Cooperative civilians were easier to manage. But it was also reflective of a broader American approach to occupation, one that would later define the post-war Reconstruction. The goal was not to destroy Japanese culture, but to separate that culture from militarism, to demonstrate that civilian life, family life, could exist without empire. Elderly civilians became, inadvertently, the most powerful witnesses to this transformation. In Japanese culture, the elderly held authority, their experiences were respected, their words carried weight. When grandmothers and grandfathers who had emerged from caves expecting death began telling others in the camps about the medical care they had received, about the American doctors who had treated their ailments, about the respect they had been shown, it created a narrative countercurrent to Japanese propaganda. These were not young people susceptible to foreign influence. These were the generation who remembered the Meiji era, who had lived through the rise of the empire, whose opinions could not be easily dismissed as naivety or collaboration. When they said the Americans were not demons, people listened. Dr. Harold Yamasaki, a Japanese-American physician from Hawaii serving with the 77th Infantry Division, became a central figure in many of these encounters. His ability to speak Japanese fluently, combined with his medical expertise, made him invaluable in treating civilian populations. His journal entries, preserved at the National Archives, provide extraordinary insight into the psychological impact of medical care on Okinawan civilians. In one entry from April 15, 1945, he describes treating an elderly man with advanced tuberculosis. The man's family had carried him into the camp on a makeshift stretcher. He was emaciated, coughing blood, clearly in the final stages. In a triage situation, he would be lowest priority. We can't cure TB in field conditions. But I sat with him. I gave him morphine for the pain. I made sure he had clean blankets. I talked to his daughter, explained what was happening, gave her time to prepare. The old man died 2 days later, but he died comfortable and his family was with him. The daughter found me after. She said something I'll never forget. She said, "You treated my father like he was your father." That wasn't a compliment about my medical skill. That was about recognition. She was saying, you saw him as human, as worthy of dignity. That's what they had been told we wouldn't do. This theme, recognition of humanity, appears repeatedly in accounts from both American servicemen and Japanese civilians. The propaganda had dehumanized both sides. Japanese civilians had been taught that Americans were racial enemies, that their ideology of individualism and democracy was a thin veneer over barbarism. American servicemen, for their part, had been conditioned to see the Japanese as fanatics, as fundamentally different, as less than human in their willingness to die for the emperor. The medical encounters on Okinawa forced both groups to confront the reality that transcended propaganda. Pain was universal. Fear was universal. The desire to protect one's children, to honor one's parents, to live with dignity, these were not cultural constructs, they were human constants. When American medics treated Japanese elderly with gentleness, they were not acting against their military interests, they were acting on the democratic principle that every individual possessed inherent worth. And when Japanese civilians recognized this treatment as genuine, they began to question what other lies they had been told. The Japanese military command recognized the danger almost immediately. By mid-April, as more civilians were surrendering and being processed through American camps, Japanese officers began actively preventing civilian escapes to American lines. There are documented cases of soldiers throwing grenades into caves where civilians were attempting to flee, of machine gun fire directed at groups waving white flags, of families being forcibly moved deeper into Japanese defensive positions to prevent their capture. This was not random cruelty. This was strategic desperation. Every civilian who returned from American captivity contradicting the propaganda narrative was a threat to military morale, to the willingness of soldiers to fight to the death, to the entire ideological framework that justified suicidal resistance. The Japanese command understood that if their soldiers began to believe that surrender meant safety, that American captivity meant humane treatment, the war would effectively end. And so they fought as desperately to control the narrative as they did to control territory. But the narrative was already escaping their control. Okinawan civilians who had been treated by American doctors began to actively seek out American lines. Families would wait until night, then slip away from Japanese positions, traveling dangerous terrain under cover of darkness to reach American forces. When they arrived, they brought not just themselves but information. The locations of Japanese positions, the conditions of soldiers, the movements of unit. This intelligence was invaluable, but more valuable still was what these civilians told other Okinawans they encountered. The Americans have food. The Americans have medicine. The Americans will not harm you. The Americans treat the elderly with respect. This grassroots communication network, grandmother to grandmother, family to family, began to undermine Japanese defensive strategy from within. The symbolic object that recurs most frequently in testimonies from this period is not a weapon or a flag, but a simple medical instrument, the stethoscope. Multiple accounts from both American medics and Japanese civilians describe the moment when a doctor placed the stethoscope against an elderly patient's chest to listen to their heartbeat. For the American doctors, this was routine diagnostic procedure. For the elderly Okinawans, it was something else entirely. It was intimacy. It was vulnerability. It was the experience of having an enemy soldier, someone they had been taught to fear above all else, lean in close, listen to the most fundamental rhythm of their life, and respond with concern rather than violence. One elderly man, interviewed years later by historians, described the experience through an interpreter. The doctor put the cold metal against my chest. He listened. His face was serious, concentrated. Then he looked at me, and he nodded like he was satisfied. He said something to the nurse, and she smiled at me. I realized he had been listening to my heart, and he was relieved it was still beating strong. He wanted me to live. This American, this enemy, he wanted me to live. In that moment, everything I had been told collapsed. If he wanted me to live, what else had been a lie? This was the transformation that Japanese propaganda could not survive. It was not defeated by counter-propaganda, by American leaflets or radio broadcasts, though those played a role. It was defeated by experience, by the direct, undeniable, physical experience of being treated with humanity by those who were supposed to be monsters. And because this experience was most concentrated among the elderly, among those whose suffering was most visible and whose survival was most dependent on medical care, it carried an emotional weight that military victories could not match. American forces were not just defeating the Japanese army on Okinawa, they were defeating the ideological foundations that sustained that army. And they were doing it with morphine, with bandages, with 4 fluids, with the simple act of listening to an old man's heartbeat and caring whether it continued. By late May 1945, as the battle entered its final brutal phase, the gap between Japanese military propaganda and civilian reality had become unbridgeable. Civilians in American camps were eating regularly, receiving medical care, and crucially, they were alive. Those still trapped in Japanese-controlled areas were starving, dying of untreated wounds, and being pressured to commit suicide to preserve Imperial honor. The contrast was stark, undeniable, and increasingly difficult for Japanese soldiers to ignore. There are recorded cases of Japanese soldiers surrendering not because they had lost the will to fight, but because they had family members in American camps and had heard, through the civilian grapevine, that their relatives were alive and well. The propaganda had always depended on isolation, on the impossibility of verifying its claims. Once verification became possible, once soldiers could confirm that their mothers, their grandparents, their children were being treated humanely, the psychological foundation for suicidal resistance began to crack. The final weeks of the Battle of Okinawa were among the most savage of the entire Pacific War. Japanese forces, compressed into the southern tip of the island, fought with the desperation of those who knew defeat was inevitable. Civilian casualties mounted horrifically as the Japanese military used them as shields, as forced labor, and in some cases, as combatants. But even in this hell, the pattern continued. American medical personnel, often working under fire, continued to treat civilian casualties. Mobile surgical units operated within range of Japanese artillery to provide care to wounded Okinawans. Medics risked their lives to evacuate injured elderly from combat zones. This was not sentimentality, it was not naive idealism. It was the manifestation of a value system that understood that how you treat the powerless, how you treat those who cannot resist or reciprocate, that this defines the moral character of a nation. And in those final terrible weeks, as the island was consumed by violence, that character was on full display. One incident, recorded in multiple after-action reports and later verified by Japanese survivors, encapsulates the entire transformation. On June 4, 1945, near the village of Madeira, a group of approximately 30 civilians, mostly elderly and children, were trapped in a cave system that had become a Japanese strongpoint. American forces had surrounded the position and were preparing to assault when an interpreter, broadcasting over loudspeakers, managed to make contact with someone inside. The voice that responded was a woman's, later identified as a schoolteacher named Chio Higa. She stated that the civilians wanted to surrender but that Japanese soldiers in the cave would kill them if they tried to leave. A negotiation followed, tense, desperate, conducted through shouted exchanges and written notes passed through the cave entrance. Finally, an agreement was reached. The Japanese soldiers would allow the civilians to leave if the Americans guaranteed safe passage and medical treatment for the wounded. The Americans agreed. Over the next hour, 32 civilians emerged from the cave. Many were injured, several were barely conscious. American medics immediately began treatment, establishing a triage area right there in the combat zone. The Japanese soldiers, observing from the cave entrance, watched as elderly men and women were given water, as children's wounds were cleaned and bandaged, as a doctor worked for 20 minutes to stabilize an elderly man who had suffered a stroke. Then, one by one, 14 Japanese soldiers emerged from the cave and surrendered. When asked later why they had given up, one soldier, through an interpreter, gave an answer that was recorded in the intelligence report. "We were told you would torture them. We saw you save them. We could not reconcile this. If we were lied to about this, what else was a lie?" This was the ultimate triumph of the Medical Corps' mission on Okinawa, not a battlefield victory but an ideological one. By treating enemy civilians, particularly the elderly, with a level of care and respect that contradicted every element of Japanese propaganda, American forces had achieved something that firepower alone could never accomplish. They had broken the psychological hold that the Imperial military had over the civilian population. They had demonstrated, through action rather than words, that democracy and humane treatment were not weaknesses but strengths, that a nation could be powerful and compassionate simultaneously, that the individual dignity of one elderly person mattered even in the midst of total war. The aftermath of the Battle of Okinawa saw approximately 100,000 Okinawan civilians killed, a staggering toll that represented nearly one-third of the island's population. But between 150,000 and 200,000 survived, the vast majority of them having passed through American medical care at some point. The stories they carried forward, the experiences they shared with their families and communities, would shape the nature of the American occupation of Japan in profound ways. When American forces landed on the main islands of Japan after the surrender in August 1945, they encountered civilian populations that had been subjected to even more intense propaganda about American brutality. But the stories from Okinawa had already begun to spread. Refugees who had been repatriated, letters that had been smuggled, even reports from Japanese military personnel, they had begun to create doubt. When American occupation forces established medical facilities, when they began distributing food, when they treated Japanese civilians with the same fundamental respect they had shown Okinawans, the resistance that Japanese militarists had hoped would materialize never emerged. The propaganda had been preemptively defeated by the reality of American behavior on Okinawa. In the years that followed, as historians and sociologists studied the occupation of Japan and the surprisingly rapid transformation of Japanese society from militarism to democracy, many pointed to structural factors, to MacArthur's reforms, to economic reconstruction, to the Cold War context. But those who interviewed the elderly, those who collected oral histories from the generation that had lived through the transition, heard a different story. They heard about American doctors who had treated them when they were wounded, about medics who had shared their rations, about the moment when they realized that the enemy they had been taught to fear saw them as human beings deserving of care. One elderly woman, interviewed in the 1970s about her experience on Okinawa, put it simply: "They could have killed us. They had every reason to hate us, to see us as the enemy. But they healed us instead. They healed us. That changed everything. Not just the war, everything." The strategic implications of this approach to civilian populations would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The recognition that hearts and minds could be won through medical care, that treating enemy civilians humanely was not just morally right but strategically advantageous, this would inform American approaches in Korea, in Vietnam, in every subsequent conflict. The results would be mixed, the execution often flawed, the context always complicated. But the principle established on Okinawa, that medical care provided to enemy civilians could undermine hostile ideology more effectively than propaganda, that principle endured. The stethoscope, that simple medical instrument, became in retrospect a symbol as powerful as any weapon in the American arsenal during the Pacific War. It represented the choice to listen rather than to destroy, to heal rather than to harm, to recognize the humanity of even those designated as enemies. When American doctors pressed that cold metal disc against the chests of elderly Okinawans and listened to their heartbeats, they were performing an act that was simultaneously medical, political, and profoundly human. They were saying, without words, that this life matters, that your survival is important, that you are not disposable. For people who had been told that they were expendable, that their value existed only in service to the empire, that individual suffering was irrelevant to collective glory, this message was revolutionary. It was, in the most literal sense, the sound of one ideology dying and another being born. The begging that occurred, the desperate pleas from Japanese civilians to remain under American protection rather than be returned to Japanese control, this was not collaboration or cowardice. It was rational evaluation of lived experience against propaganda. These civilians had been told that Americans were demons. They had discovered that American medics would stay up through the night to monitor an elderly patient's fever, that American doctors would use precious penicillin to save a child who belonged to the enemy, that American nurses would hold the hand of a dying grandmother and show her dignity in her final moments. When faced with the choice between returning to a system that had lied to them and staying with those who had treated them with unexpected humanity, they chose humanity. This was not a rejection of Japanese culture or identity. It was a rejection of militarism, of propaganda, of an ideology that had reduced them to tools of war. They were choosing life, dignity, and the possibility of a future that valued individual human worth over abstract imperial glory. The final image from this period, preserved in photographs now held at the National Archives, shows a scene from a civilian hospital established by the American military government on Okinawa in July 1945. An elderly Okinawan man, his arm in a cast, is being helped to his feet by an American nurse. She is smiling. He is smiling. Between them, on a small table, sits a stethoscope. In the background, other patients, other medical staff, the machinery of care and recovery. The war is still technically ongoing, the Japanese home islands have not yet surrendered, but in this small hospital room, the future is already visible. It is a future where former enemies share space, where healing transcends nationality, where the elderly are treated with respect regardless of which flag they once saluted. It is the future that Japanese propaganda said was impossible, that militarism insisted could never exist, that the entire imperial ideology had been constructed to prevent. And yet there it is, captured in black and white, undeniable, real. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, when the emperor made his radio address announcing surrender, when the occupation of Japan began in earnest, the groundwork had already been laid by countless small encounters between American medical personnel and Japanese civilians. The elderly of Okinawa, those who had been treated gently when they expected brutality, they became ambassadors for a new possibility. Their testimony, their survival, their willingness to speak about their experiences, these undermined militarist resistance more effectively than any weapon. They proved that democracy was not a disease but a framework for human dignity, that individual worth was not weakness but strength, that a nation could be powerful precisely because it valued even the least powerful among its enemies. The lesson of Okinawa was not about military tactics or strategic innovation. It was about the power of consistency between values and action. American democratic ideals, so often reduced to abstract principles or dismissed as propaganda, were made real through the simple act of medical care. When those ideals were tested, when Americans were given the opportunity to brutalize enemy civilians, to treat them as less than human, to prioritize military efficiency over individual suffering, and they chose instead to provide care, to show gentleness, to honor human dignity, they proved that their values were more than rhetoric. They demonstrated, in the most tangible way possible, that a society built on the worth of the individual would extend that recognition even to those who had been designated as enemies. In the end, the Japanese civilians who begged to stay, who chose American protection over repatriation, who testified to the gentleness of American doctors, they were not betraying their heritage. They were reclaiming their humanity from an ideology that had sought to subsume it. They were choosing a future where their grandchildren would be valued as individuals rather than as instruments of state power. They were choosing the possibility of peace over the certainty of endless war. And they were making that choice because American medical personnel, working under impossible conditions, had shown them that such a choice was possible, that there existed in the world a system of values that saw them, truly saw them, as human beings deserving of care and respect. The stethoscope, in this context, becomes more than a medical instrument. It becomes the symbol of listening, of attention, of the willingness to care about whether another heart continues to beat. When American doctors listened to the hearts of elderly Okinawans, they were performing an act of recognition that transcended the boundaries of war. They were saying, in the most fundamental way possible, I hear you, I see you, your life has value, your suffering matters. For people who had been reduced to numbers, to strategic considerations, to propaganda tools, this recognition was transformative. It was proof that a different world was possible, a world where they could be seen as individuals rather than as representatives of an enemy nation, where their age and vulnerability would be met with care rather than exploitation, where the fact of their humanity would be sufficient to guarantee them dignity. This is the story that history often overlooks in favor of battles and body counts, of strategic decisions and geopolitical consequences. But it is, perhaps, the more important story. It is the story of how a medical corps, armed with stethoscopes and sulfa drugs, with gentleness and respect, defeated an ideology that millions of lives and years of propaganda had been unable to shake. It is the story of how the choice to heal rather than harm, to care rather than ignore, to recognize rather than dehumanize, can transform not just individuals but entire societies. It is the story of democracy made manifest not in speeches or documents, but in the hands of doctors treating enemy wounded, in the patience of nurses caring for the elderly, in the simple profound act of listening to a human heart and choosing to help it keep beating. The elderly of Okinawa who experienced American medical care, who survived because of it, who testified to it, they carried forward a truth that would reshape their nation. That truth was simple, devastating to the old order, and full of possibility for the new. It was this, that human dignity is not conditional on nationality, that compassion is not weakness, that the measure of a civilization is not in its capacity for destruction but in its treatment of the vulnerable. When they begged to stay, when they chose American protection over Japanese control, they were voting with their lives for this truth. They were rejecting the lie that had cost their island so much blood. And they were embracing, tentatively, hopefully, fearfully, the possibility that the future could be different from the past, that their grandchildren might live in a world where the sound of a heartbeat, any heartbeat, would be met with a desire to preserve it rather than to silence it. This is the legacy of those desperate weeks on Okinawa, not the battles won or lost, but the hearts listened to, the lives saved, the gentleness shown when brutality would have been easier, expected, even justified by the logic of total war. It is a legacy written not in the language of strategy or tactics, but in the quiet testimony of the elderly, of those who experienced firsthand the collision between propaganda and reality, between the ideology of dehumanization and the practice of care. It is a legacy that reminds us that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is not the one that destroys the most efficiently, but the one that refuses to destroy at all, that chooses instead to listen, to heal, to recognize the fundamental worth of every human life, even those belonging to the enemy. Even those belonging to the elderly, who in the cold calculus of war have no strategic value. Especially those. The stethoscope, pressed against an old woman's chest in a field hospital on a contested island in the spring of 1945, listening to a heart that propaganda said should not matter, that military necessity said was expendable, that ideology said was less than human. Listening and hearing a beat that deserved to continue. That is the image that should endure, that is the truth that history must not forget. That in the midst of the most terrible war in human history, in the context of absolute enmity, there were those who chose to listen to human hearts and work to keep them beating. And in that choice, in that simple profound act of care, a different future became possible. A future where former enemies could share space, could recognize each other's humanity, could build together something better than what had been destroyed. The elderly of Okinawa who begged to stay, they were the first witnesses to that future. And their testimony, their survival, their transformation from expected victims to living proof of an alternative possibility, that was the beginning of the peace that followed. Not the peace of surrender, but the peace of recognition, of reconciliation, of the choice to hear another's heartbeat and care whether it continues. That is the peace worth fighting for. That is the peace worth remembering. That is the peace that began with gentleness, with medicine, with the simple revolutionary act of treating the enemy's elderly as if they were our own.